In 1943,
Sir, United States Marines sees Liberator bombers launching the softening up.
the Pacific trembled as the Allies targeted Japan's strongest fortress, the vast, seemingly untouchable base at Rabaul. But instead of storming its walls, they chose to strangle it from afar. One island, one swamp, one brutal battle at a time. This is how an empire was cut off, isolated, and left to die in the jungle. Subscribe to No Man's Land for more untold war history. By mid-1943, Allied commanders faced a nightmare unlike anything else in the Pacific: Rabaul. It wasn't just a base, it was the beating heart of Japan's entire southwestern empire. A fortress carved into volcanic rock and packed with more than 100,000 soldiers. Miles of tunnels, anti-aircraft positions, fuel depots, and airfields that could launch hundreds of planes at a moment's notice. If the Allies wanted to liberate the Philippines, if they wanted to push north toward Japan, they had to neutralize Rabaul. But one truth became painfully clear. Attacking it head-on would be suicide. General Douglas MacArthur understood the stakes. He believed stripping Rabaul of its power was the key to fulfilling his promise: "I shall return." Yet every analysis, every map study, every strategic simulation pointed to the same conclusion. A frontal assault would drown the Allies in casualties and drag on for months. Rabaul was designed to be impregnable, a citadel surrounded by jungles, cliffs, and oceans that all worked in Japan's favor. So the Allies adopted a new philosophy: don't attack the fortress, starve it. Cut its supply routes, seize the airfields around it, and choke its armies without ever touching the main walls. This strategy became Operation Cartwheel, a massive multi-step plan to encircle Rabaul by capturing the islands and coastal strongholds that fed it. One of the most crucial pieces of this wheel was New Britain Island, specifically the western region where two Japanese airfields, Cape Gloucester and Arawe, threatened every Allied move. If those airfields fell, Rabaul would no longer be a spear. It would become a trapped animal, isolated from the rest of the war. That single shift would change the entire Pacific campaign. And so, in December 1943, after months of planning, rehearsals, and intelligence gathering, the Allies finally struck. The first landing would begin not with the roar of a main assault, but with a quiet deception designed to mislead the Japanese and set the stage for something far greater. The battle for New Britain was about to begin, and with it, the slow death of Rabaul's empire-sized fortress. The first blow of Operation Cartwheel did not fall on Cape Gloucester, the true target, but on a quiet stretch of New Britain's southwest coast, known as Arawe. To the Japanese, it was a backwater. To the Allies, it was the perfect place for a feint. A strike meant to confuse commanders at Rabaul and pull their attention away from the real assault to come. On December 15, 1943, well before dawn, the sea was swallowed in mist as Task Force 76 approached the shoreline. Inside the landing craft were the men of the 112th Cavalry Regiment, a mechanized unit unaccustomed to the Pacific's brutality, but tasked with one job: establish a foothold and convince the Japanese this was the main invasion. As the crafts closed in, Allied destroyers opened fire, shaking the earth and shredding coconut groves along the beach. Marines later described the barrage as a moving wall of thunder, meant to break any resistance. Yet when the ramps dropped, the expected slaughter never came. Only a few scattered Japanese fired from makeshift positions, barely enough to slow the advance. The truth soon became clear. The Japanese had not fortified Arawe because they never believed the Allies would attack there. The deception was already working. By noon, the cavalry had secured plantations, pushed inland, and began preparing defenses while engineers unloaded supplies. But the quiet did not last. Several days later, Japanese forces struck back in a small counterattack, rushing through the jungle in an attempt to collapse the new beachhead. The Americans responded with tanks, artillery, and relentless small arms fire that broke the assault within hours. What remained of the enemy withdrew into the rainforest, convinced a larger landing was imminent. And that was exactly what the Allies wanted. Arawe was never meant to be the turning point of the campaign. It was bait, a carefully staged distraction that forced Japanese commanders to redirect forces, shift their scouting patrols, and brace for a full-scale invasion in the wrong location. By the time the Japanese realized the truth, it would already be too late. The real storm was moving toward Cape Gloucester, and it would hit with a fury no one on New Britain was prepared to face. At dawn on December 26, 1943, the true weight of Operation Cartwheel revealed itself. As the mist began to lift from the coastline of Cape Gloucester, the men of the 1st Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal, stood shoulder to shoulder on the decks of their transports, staring into a wall of jungle so dark and dense it seemed to swallow the rising sun. This was no ordinary battlefield. It was a living maze the Marines would later call the Green Inferno. Before they hit the beaches, the world erupted around them. American and Australian warships from Task Force 74 unleashed a devastating bombardment, tearing apart coastal defenses and shaking the ground miles inland. The jungle caught fire in patches, yet even through the flames, the Marines felt an unsettling truth. The enemy was still out there, silent, hidden, watching. At 7:45 a.m., the landing craft dropped their ramps. Marines stepped into waist-deep surf, rifles held high, pushing forward as waves hammered their legs. But instead of gunfire, they were met with something stranger: silence. Not a single Japanese soldier defended the shoreline. It was not mercy. It was a trap laid by the terrain itself. The moment the Marines pushed inland, they learned what their true opponent would be. The jungle closed in around them like a fist, mud sucking at their boots, vines coiling around gear, mosquitoes swarming in clouds thick enough to choke on. The heat smothered every breath. Entire squads became stuck in swamps that swallowed men up to their chests. One Marine recorded in his diary, "We moved 1 mile in 5 hours. The island didn't want us here." And nature struck first blood. A dead tree, rotted from the inside by years of rain, collapsed without warning, crushing the division's first casualty before he ever saw an enemy soldier. Still, the Marines pressed forward, hacking their way through the mangrove swamps with machetes. Every step felt like walking deeper into the throat of the island. Then, somewhere in the shadows, a single rifle cracked. The bullet snapped through branches overhead. The Japanese had begun their fight. Suddenly, the jungle erupted with muzzle flashes. Hidden trenches, camouflaged bunkers, and sniper nests sprang to life. The Marines could not see who was shooting at them. Only the glint of steel or the brief glow of a muzzle flash before disappearing into the foliage. Cape Gloucester was no longer an island. It had become a battlefield built by nature itself, one where every hill, every tree, every shadow worked in the enemy's favor. The battle for Gloucester had officially begun. As the Marines pushed deeper into Cape Gloucester, they discovered the shoreline was only the beginning of the nightmare. Beneath the tangled canopy, the Japanese had transformed the jungle into a fortress, one designed to bleed the invaders dry. Colonel Iwao Matsuda, commanding roughly 4,000 hardened troops of the 53rd Regiment, had spent months shaping the terrain, into a lethal maze of trenches, firing slits, snaking tunnels, and camouflaged bunkers so well concealed that Marines sometimes walked past them before taking fire from behind. The Japanese had been stunned by the naval bombardment, but not broken. Within hours, they regrouped in the interior, prepared to fight with the unyielding resolve expected by the Imperial Army. Later, Marine reports made the situation clear. They were ordered to die where they stood, and nearly all of them did. The fighting escalated immediately. Patrols sent ahead vanished into sheets of gunfire. Snipers fired from treetop platforms invisible to the naked eye. Every ridge, every bend, every thicket hid a potential ambush. As the Marines advanced toward the airfield, the ultimate prize, terrain features with simple names like Target Hill, Hill 660, and Aogiri Ridge became killing fields echoing with machine gun bursts and shouted commands swallowed by the jungle. The heat made everything worse. Weapons jammed. Flamethrower fuel thickened in the humidity, giving only sputtering bursts. Bazooka rounds bounced harmlessly off soaked earthworks. The Marines often fought at distances so close that grenades scarcely needed to be thrown, just rolled forward like stones. In one chaotic engagement, an Amtrak loaded with ammunition tried pushing through shattered trees to resupply the front. Its .50 caliber machine gun raked enemy positions until a well-timed ambush pinned it down. Japanese soldiers surged out of trenches with grenades and submachine guns, killing the gunners instantly. The driver, refusing to abandon his vehicle, leapt back into the cab, floored the engine, and rammed straight through a bunker, collapsing the tunnel beneath it and crushing the defenders. By nightfall of December 26th, the Japanese launched their own counterattack, a desperate attempt to shove the Marines back into the sea. They charged through waist-deep mud and blasted tree stumps, screaming into the darkness. But Marine machine guns and naval artillery hammered them down, turning the assault into a slaughter illuminated by muzzle flashes and explosions reflecting off rain-soaked leaves. When dawn arrived, the Marines held the ground. But the rugged hills, the choking jungle, and the unseen tunnels ahead promised one thing. The worst fighting was still waiting for them. By the morning of December 27th, the Marines had secured the beaches, but the real objective, Cape Gloucester Airfield, still lay hidden behind miles of swamp, razor-edged ridges, and a labyrinth of Japanese defenses. The moment the first patrols began pushing inland, it became clear that the terrain itself was an enemy every bit as deadly as the Imperial troops defending it. Progress toward the airfield stalled almost immediately as the Marines entered a nightmare world later known simply as the Green Inferno. The ground dissolved beneath their boots. Entire platoons sank waist-deep into black mud, so thick it trapped rifles and tore off shoes. Some sections, like the infamous damp flats, were so waterlogged that Marines had to form human chains to extract men from the muck. Trees collapsed without warning, their roots rotted through by decades of moisture. One Marine didn't even make it to the fighting. He was crushed by a falling trunk before seeing the enemy. The air itself felt hostile. Heat and humidity smothered the lungs. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. Leeches clung to ankles. Even the constant odor, rot, mold, and wet jungle seemed predatory. Veterans later admitted they expected death at any moment, not from bullets, but from the land swallowing them. And still, the Japanese waited. On the ridges ahead, Matsuda's troops fortified every contour of the terrain. Snipers hid in trees, firing single rounds that echoed like thunder. Machine gun nests were tucked behind ferns and vines, invisible until they erupted. When the Marines finally reached Target Hill, They ran straight into an interlocking trench network, so intricate it resembled a subterranean city. Flamethrowers sputtered in the damp air, their flames dying before reaching the bunkers. Mortar shells thudded harmlessly into mud. The Marines were forced to fight bunker by bunker, rooting out defenders with grenades and point-blank rifle fire. The Japanese responded with sudden countercharges, short, violent bursts meant to disrupt the American advance before vanishing back into the jungle. On December 29th, after days of grinding combat, the Marines launched their major push for the airfield. Supported by M4 Sherman tanks and artillery creeping forward yard by yard, they smashed through Matsuda's final defensive line. Grenades rolled down tunnels. Bunkers collapsed. Snipers were flushed from trees by disciplined rifle fire. By sunset, the Marines stood on the battered grounds of the Cape Gloucester Airfield, surrounded by wrecked aircraft, splintered palm groves, and the smoldering remains of Japanese fortifications. They had taken the objective, but the jungle refused to let them celebrate. Because as they raised the American flag, the sky began to darken. And far out over the ocean, a storm was coming. Victory at Cape Gloucester Airfield should have marked a turning point, proof that the Marines had broken through Japan's outer ring of defenses. Instead, within hours of securing the airfield, the island unleashed a new enemy that no rifle or flamethrower could fight. As dusk settled on December 26th, the ocean winds shifted, the temperature dropped, and a deep rolling thunder crawled across the horizon. Moments later, the sky split open. What followed was not rain. It was a 5-day deluge, a wall of water that transformed the battlefield into a drowning, sucking wasteland. Torrents poured down from the ridges, turning paths into rivers and foxholes into pits of sludge. Marines watched helplessly as weapons rusted in their hands, tents collapsed under the weight of water, and hastily built roads dissolved back into the earth. Vehicles sank to their axles. The only craft still able to move were the amphibious Amtraks, which became lifelines carrying ammunition and food through the rising flood. Every hour of every day, the storm beat down with unrelenting fury. Men slept standing up or curled against trees because the ground had become an ocean of knee-deep mud. Uniforms remained permanently soaked, clinging to skin already rubbed raw by days of sweat and grime. The smell of mildew haunted every breath, mixing with the stench of decay rising from the forest floor. Even fire, the Marines' most reliable ally, refused to cooperate. Matches would not spark. Fuel would not light. Everything was waterlogged, and the jungle was just getting started. Mosquitoes swarmed in biblical numbers. Leeches clung to skin beneath soaked clothing. Fevers surged through camps, leaving men shaking uncontrollably in the humid dark. Lightning cracked above the canopy, illuminating shattered trees and casting giant shadows that made the jungle seem alive. For some Marines, the storm felt worse than combat, an endless test of endurance, without a target to shoot, without an enemy to blame. Yet despite the chaos, the Japanese were not broken. Hidden in the southern ridges, Matsuda's surviving troops used the storm as cover. They dug deeper, moved unseen, and prepared new defensive positions. The Marines, battered by weather and exhaustion, knew the fight for Cape Gloucester was not over, because once the rain slowed and the clouds began to thin, one truth became painfully clear. The Japanese were still out there, and they had no intention of letting the Americans keep the airfield without a final, bloody struggle. When the rain finally eased in early January 1944, the Marines emerged from the mud like survivors of a shipwreck, exhausted, soaked, fever-ridden, but still determined. Cape Gloucester Airfield was in American hands, but the high ridges to the south, dense with jungle and fortified by the Japanese, still threatened the new foothold. Commanders believed a sizable enemy force remained entrenched there, ready to strike the moment American lines weakened. They were right. On January 2nd, the Marines began a sweeping advance toward the ridges, determined to clear the last major pockets of resistance. The jungle, still saturated from the storms, made progress agonizingly slow. Every ridge became a choke point, every ravine a trap, every step a gamble. The Japanese of the 141st Regiment, roughly 3,000 men, were dug in with a fanatic determination that bordered on suicidal resolve. Many had been ordered to fight to the last man. Most intended to obey. Skirmishes broke out almost immediately. What began as scattered rifle cracks soon escalated into vicious, up-close firefights, where visibility rarely exceeded a few yards. Japanese troops fought from camouflaged spider holes, narrow trenches, and tunnels that seemed to breathe men into the jungle. Marines would capture one bunker only to find another hidden behind it, manned by soldiers who refused to surrender. Tanks were brought forward, but even the Shermans found themselves bogged down in the sodden earth or wedged between fallen trees. On the night of December 30th, during the height of the storm, a Japanese force of nearly 100 men launched a suicide attack against the western marine perimeter. Driven by desperation and the code of no retreat, they charged through sheets of rain, screaming, firing submachine guns, and hurling grenades. The fight lasted 5 hours. Marines battled in mud up to their shins, firing point-blank into shadows illuminated only by lightning. By dawn, the attackers were gone, every one of them dead. Still, the Japanese main body continued to slip away. Their commanders knew the position was hopeless. The airfield had fallen, supply lines were severed, and the jungle itself offered little protection against artillery and air power. Under cover of night, they abandoned strong points and retreated eastward, hoping to regroup deeper inside New Britain. The Marines pressed forward until January 16th, when Cape Gloucester was officially declared secure. But the victory was sobering. Over 300 Marines had been killed, more than 1,000 wounded. Nearly 2,000 Japanese defenders died, many from hunger, disease, or their own refusal to surrender. And beyond the ridges, the island still stretched on, vast, wild, and filled with enemy troops who had no intention of giving up. Cape Gloucester was won, but New Britain was far from finished. The campaign was about to shift from battles to a brutal, grinding war of isolation, one that would slowly starve Japan's greatest fortress into silence. Even as Marines fought through Cape Gloucester's ridges, the true destruction of Japan's power in the region was happening far to the east. Beginning in late 1943 and escalating into early 1944, the Allies unleashed one of the most relentless aerial bombardments of the Pacific War. An air campaign designed not to breach Rabaul's defenses, but to bury them. Rabaul had once been the jewel of Japan's Pacific Empire, a fortress bristling with airfields, fuel depots, naval repair yards, and anti-aircraft batteries. Now, it was a target. The U.S. 5th Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force struck day after day, flying hundreds of sorties from New Guinea and Bougainville. B-24 Liberators and B-25 Mitchells swarmed the skies, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on runways, supply dumps, and warships anchored in Simpson Harbor. What the bombs didn't destroy, strafing runs finished off. Gunboats, barges, and transports were turned into burning wreckage. By February 1944, Rabaul's fleet had effectively ceased to exist. Any ship sent to reinforce or evacuate the garrison would be sunk before it reached the harbor. Japan knew it, and Allied intelligence knew it too. Rabaul was no longer a fortress, it was a trap. When the last Japanese air sortie rose to challenge the bombers on February 19th, the result was heartbreaking for the defenders. Only a handful of weather-beaten Zero fighters struggled into the sky, piloted by exhausted men who had watched their world crumble. Most were shot down within minutes. Those who survived returned to airfields cratered beyond repair. From that day forward, Allied aircraft owned Rabaul's sky completely. With the air sealed off and the sea patrolled by Allied ships, Rabaul became an island within an island. Supplies dwindled rapidly. Fuel vanished first. Ammunition followed. Then, medicine. What remained of Japan's once mighty garrison, nearly 70,000 soldiers, was ordered to stay, fight if possible, endure if not. Tokyo decreed that Rabaul must hold, even if cut off entirely. The garrison became a forgotten army. The Japanese response was grim, but disciplined. Troops tunneled deep into the volcanic hills, carving underground shelters and stockpiling what scraps they could salvage. Many units turned to farming, clearing patches of jungle to grow vegetables, raising pigs and chickens to stave off starvation. Australian scouts later described the eerie sight of uniformed soldiers tending rice paddies where aircraft once taxied and destroyers once docked. Disease became a more lethal enemy than bombs. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever ripped through the ranks. Medicine had run out months earlier. Men lay in dark tunnels, shivering with fever while artillery rumbled in the distance. Reports reaching Tokyo dwindled into bleak, clipped messages. Many dead, supplies critical, morale uncertain. One officer wrote, "I do not know a single man who is not ill." Japan's high command understood the truth long before the soldiers did. Rabaul was lost. But instead of evacuating their men, they made a cold decision. They would remain as a symbolic barrier, a locked door behind which Allied armies would never bother to tread. Rabaul didn't fall in a single day. It didn't fall in a single battle. It simply starved, as the empire that built it slowly collapsed around it. And as 1944 continued, the question shifted from when Rabaul would fall to whether it even mattered anymore. The fortress had become a graveyard, and the war was moving on without it. By early 1945, Rabaul was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers lived like shadows in the jungle, cut off from their homeland, surviving on gardens carved from the volcanic soil. Disease ravaged entire units. Starvation hollowed out once elite regiments. Yet still, orders were clear. Hold Rabaul at all costs. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the truth finally reached them. Slowly, almost unbelievingly. After nearly 2 years of isolation, 69,000 surviving Japanese troops emerged from their tunnels. On September 6th, aboard HMS Glory, Generals Imamura and Kusaka formally surrendered. The once mighty stronghold was silent now, its bunkers empty, its airfields wrecked, its soldiers gaunt and broken. Rabaul had never been taken by force. It simply faded, consumed by time, disease, and the weight of a war it could no longer fight.